And I just wanted to clarify, because I've said it over and over and over again to like multiple places where I'm getting moved from as of recently, where like, you know, basically what ends up happening is people are okay with me in a location or whatever, and then like, you know, I'll basically be helping them out, like, you know, sort of listening to what they have to say, and then going like, I'm like, okay, you know, like this is what you want, this is what I want, you seem to provide me with what I want, and like I'm gonna help you get what you want. And then like basically like as soon as I'm not necessarily feeling that it's like mutual anymore, like I start not like I'm not as proactive as basically like as trying to like look after the people around me essentially. So I'm like going like, okay, like, and then I'm like, hey, like, you know, if you actually like me, you're probably just gonna like, you know, chill out and just like we can vibe, and like I don't have to do anything for you, you don't have to do anything for me, kind of thing. And then like once it hits that, some people will go like, oh well, I just need I gotta take, and I'm like, wait a second, like I was like, I've given a lot, like, and I haven't actually asked for all that much, you know what I mean? And I'm like, I'm actually in the mode of just being self-sufficient and non-dependent. So like I'm happy to like generate information and generate things to just like give away, but not beyond basically being unsustainable. And then I'm like, okay, so like, and then I'm at the point where I'm just like, well, what's sustainable? And I'm like, well, nothing's really sustainable. So I'm just gonna like basically give till I'm empty, and then like when I'm empty, I essentially have a reason to leave because I'm in a state of emergency, right? And then if that person at the end of it doesn't understand that, like, you know, I gave everything I got, like you know, I'm like, okay, like, you know, so yeah. So basically what ends up happening though is it gets kind of dangerous, because like, let's say like I'll go to my parents, right? And then like literally I arrive there, you know, I start doing laundry to clean myself, you know, and then they just bitch about me cleaning myself, you know, and they like meticulously pick apart everything I do if I don't put anything back exactly where I found it and better than I found it, you know. Then like it's open ground for like World War III basically. And yeah, and then so like after I'm finished with that, you know, after being like homeless for a week, you know what I mean? Like it's hard to remember stuff. Like if you're homeless for a week and then you just show up in an environment that like demands more, then you're like, holy shit, like, you know, I'm like, what the fuck am I doing here? But at the same time, I'm like, oh, you know what, like, I appreciate basically like a bed, right? Yeah, and then I was like, okay. But then they're kicking me out. So they're like, okay, well, we're done with you. We don't actually want you here anymore, Harley. Like, go away, you know? And I'm like, okay, just help me so I never have to come back, right? Because what I learned from basically, yeah, like that interaction that I had with my parents is that it actually just happens again and again wherever I go. So if I'm at my parents, they just go like, oh, well, we don't want you here, so like go to the hospital. And then I go to the hospital, and then the hospital's like, you know, if you don't want to get medicated, Harley, like you can't be here. And then I'm like, okay. So then I go to a drop-in center, and then the drop-in center's like, well, if you don't have a bed here, you can't stay here. You know what I mean? And I'm like, okay. And then I go to another drop-in center where I get food, and then I'm like, hey, do you have a washroom? And they're like, no, just go to the train station. So then I go to the train station, and then the train station's like, did you buy a ticket? You can't necessarily be here unless you don't have a ticket. And I'm like, fuck, I'm go back to the emergency departments. And then I go to the emergency department. I'm like, hey guys, like literally, I donated all my stuff, you know. Before I donated all my stuff, I was interested in assisted dying because I didn't want to go to the point where I'm basically like going from place to place, because like everybody has a legal right to just not my problem. Like, and I'm a fucking human being. I'm not a pair of shoes. You know what I mean? Like, what the fuck? Like, so it's like they're basically trying to bully me. In my opinion, I'm being bullied into participating with like a work system, you know? So I'm like, okay, so like if you're not working to make money, then you're just walking around, or you're working to basically you're doing unpaid volunteering so that like security has a job in basically pushing you out of a building, right? Or other people have a headache that distracts them from like things that are probably way more important, you know what I mean? Like, so like my dad, for example, my mom and dad, you know, like they want to go on vacation. They like straight up with me. They're like, Harley, like, can you just leave so that like we can go to work, or can you just leave so we can just like get some sleep, right? And I'm like, holy shit, guys, like, I'm like, yeah, sure, of course, but like I don't understand. Like, I was like, wait, how did you lose sleep, right? And then at the same time, I'm like, yeah, you took my key away, but like there was no like, I don't really understand the justification for you taking my key away. You know what I mean? I didn't do anything wrong by your own standards, really. Like, you know, but if you're basically requesting your key back, it's like okay, right? It's the same thing. Like when I was, yeah. So it's like when I had a partner or whatever, she didn't like ask for her key back, but she made things like so uncomfortable that I was like, here you go. Like, I'm afraid like you're bullying me into me giving you your key back. And I'm like, just so you know, like that's how I feel. You know what I mean? And she's like, no, it's not like that. And I'm like, okay, well, like, you know, like I kind of have to just give you your key back because like I kind of feel like you're like setting me up for something, like, and I'm like, but I can't even tell her that part because she's already cut me off and is like out the door. You know what I mean? Every fucking time, literally every fucking time. I was like, I think I'm gonna give you your key back. No, don't do that. I was like, can I tell you why? And then she's gone, and I was like, okay, like there's basically like a shutdown of communication. So basically, people go like, well, not my problem, and then they just shut down the communication every time. And that's not really fair. And I can understand if it's too much for them, where they're like, communication is too much for me at the moment, so like, I'm gonna leave you the fuck alone, right? And I was like, because I've been there too, you know what I mean? I'm like, okay, right? So like the term is called ghosting, essentially. So like, you know, like if somebody's overwhelming you, then you just like leave them alone, give them their space, right? And that's so like securities with the doctors and the nurses or whatever. Like I actually think like there's a heavy security presence in the hospitals, like in the hospital emergencies, and I'm like, why is this? Like I was like, this makes no sense. People in emergency are not necessarily even remotely capable of fighting or defending themselves because they're in emergency for a reason. They're in emergency because they can't fight back, basically, in my opinion. Like that's just my opinion. But they might look threatening, right? So people who want to help other people, like, you know, if someone is in a state of duress, like if you're driven crazy, you can look fucking mean. Like, you can look really fucking mean. If you're crazy, right? So I'm like, okay, you know, so I gotta be like duck face, like I gotta be like all pretty. You know? I don't know if I'm doing that really. I don't know if I'm being. I gotta like looking sexy helps. Like I don't know how I can look sexy, but like, you know, like it will look like flirtatious or something. Like I don't know, pull my hair back, like, you know, like look kind of like bougie, like, but like yeah, but like it doesn't help. Like it doesn't help to look. it doesn't help to look like that, right? It's the same, like, if I showed up in emergency basically, like, screaming my head off, because I'd love to just scream my head off most of the time, they just medicate me, and I've been medicated in the past, and that sucks. Like, that just drove me even more insane. So I'm like, okay, like, literally logic wins, guys, so, like, we just gotta be logical about this shit, right? So I'm like, okay, you know, I'm in a system that's, like, robotic and stuff like that, so I'm like, okay, the point here is, like, you know, like, if you're facing a system essentially that's, like, robotic or whatever, then you gotta be like, you just have to, like, communicate you have to learn their language to then communicate that, like, hey, like, this isn't fair, right? By the way, like, this is how you can improve your language. You know what I mean? But who am I to say, like, this is how you can improve your language? Like, it's like the dumbest thing ever. So, like, I totally just want to go and not be around anymore, because, like, who am I to say, like, you're abusing me, you taught me, or, like, the system taught me a language that I'm using, and it's really flawed, and it's upsetting me, and I don't know how to deal with it. And, like, literally, like, it seems like there's just, like, this negative downward, like, this negative cycle of basically just abuse, in my opinion, where, you know, I'll literally be like poke, and then if I'm, like, making a face like this, they're like, ooh, he's making a face, and then they're like, boom, and I'm like, oh, you know, and I'm like, oh, fuck, and then they're like, he looks even meaner, and then I show up to emergency like this. And then emergency, like, the doctors who are, like, you know, like little angels, you know, are like, they're like, not all of them, I'm being biased, but, like I'm trying to like invent reasons why, like, there's such a heavy security presence, you know, because, like, I shouldn't be leaving the emergency department if I'm asking for assisted dying, right? But they're just being procedural, and they're like, you know, we can't do that for you. And I'm like, okay, like, but, like, just so you know, like, in my opinion, I shouldn't be out on the street talking to people, because, like, if you can't basically, like, if I'm out on the street talking to people, I might be creating more people who relate to me, who could eventually show up in emergency the same way I am right now, right? And I know, based on, like, my experience, that if they were subject to the same forces that basically made me the way I am, they would have a much worse reaction. And that's concerning, because I was allowed to basically, like, digest everything so that, like, you know, I didn't have, like, a really stupid reaction that ended up, like, me being in prison or something, you know, because I was literally, like, driven so fucking crazy that, like, I could have very easily, like, done something extremely bad and ended up in prison, right? And medication just made it all worse. Like, yeah. So I'm like basically, like, yeah. So, like, you'd basically have someone show up, right, in a state of duress, and then you would misinterpret them as basically just, like, misbehaving, right? And then you'd call security, who would just make the situation worse, or you would have them formed, which would make the situation worse. And then, yeah, like, I'm like, okay, like, it doesn't, like, I was like, yeah, it's just like, please, can we take people for their word? I know it sounds crazy when someone shows up and they're like psych ward worthy, like, in terms of, like, what they're communicating, and I'm like, reality is actually that big, you know? It's not actually, like, it's not all that, like, easily defined, you know, and, like, easily categorized, like, and I'm like, it gets fucking crazy. Like, I'm like, and unfortunately, like, a lot of people don't believe that, and I'm actually, like, I used to not believe that, you know what I mean? I'd be like, okay, you know, like, somebody would come up to me and be like, they'd be talking about God or whatever, and I'm like, just sort of roll my eyes because I'm like, yeah. I was like, whatever. Now I'm like, okay. You know what I mean? I just roll my eyes like extra fucking big because I'm like, you know what? There's something a lot bigger than a fucking God. I had no idea, but like, yeah, however you're defining God or whatever, I was like, I was like, okay, that's pretty nice. That's a pretty nice like Santa Claus. Like, thank you. Like, I was like, I want you to keep believing in Santa Claus because like, you know what? Like, it's a nice idea, but like, you know, in the wrong context though, like just so you know, like it's a little insensitive and like kind of inappropriate. But like, you know, like I got no problem with the way you're using it right now. It's just like, you know, heads up, like you're in for a surprise. Like if you're gonna pull that card or like, you know, that kind of explanation, like in certain areas, you know what I mean? Like I'm not just gonna walk into a church and be like, hey, like your fucking religion's stupid, you know what I mean? Like, and expect like, you know, like I'm not like, I was like, that's a dumb idea, you know what I mean? But like someone basically coming up to me and pushing God or whatever is basically doing that. You know what I mean? I'm like, okay. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just like, oh, like Twitch.